It began on the third coldest day of November when Elsie Marlowe, a 26-year-old bakery assistant in a coat too thin for the wind and a wallet too light for rent, handed her last unsold loaf of sourdough to a hooded man seated outside the train station, his hands shaking from either the cold or something deeper, and without knowing why, she pushed it into his hands with a small nod, saying only, "It's still warm," before walking away, unaware that this quiet moment would fracture and rewire her entire life. It wasn't that she made a habit of helping strangers, but something about his silence, unapologetic, unblinking, felt heavy, like he was carrying a storm beneath that hood, and she didn't know that while she lay that night in her rented room with no heating, bundled under thrifted blankets and calculating how many days she had left before eviction. The same man stood under the streetlight across from her building for over an hour without moving. Over the next few days, she thought nothing of him. Her job was under threat. Her boss was cutting hours, and she'd taken to skipping meals just to stretch what little she had. But the memory of the hooded stranger stayed like a splinter in her thoughts until on the 6th day, she came home to find the landlord waiting at her door with a notice in hand and no sympathy in his eyes, informing her that by next week, she'd have to leave unless she could miraculously pay 3 months rent in full, which she couldn't, and it was then, while she stood frozen and humiliated on her doorstep, that a sleek black car pulled up behind them, and a man in a tailored gray coat stepped out and said calmly, "Miss Marlowe won't be needing this notice," handing the landlord a thick envelope that changed the man's face instantly from stern to confused compliance. Elsie blinked, unsure if she was dreaming, until the man turned to her with a smile that did not reach his eyes and added, "You gave something when you had nothing. Now it's time to receive something you didn't ask for." And before she could even form a reply, he slipped a business card into her palm with nothing on it but a phone number and a symbol and outline of a hood, and was gone. Confused, she stared down at the card and then, against all reason, dialed the number. But it rang once and disconnected. And that night as she sat in her kitchen, eating the first full meal she'd had in days, groceries mysteriously delivered to her door, she realized with dawning awe and unease that someone was watching. Not out of malice, but with purpose. And when she finally gathered the nerve to walk back to that train station corner the next morning, the hooded man was gone, replaced only by a folded piece of paper taped to the wall behind where he used to sit that read, "Gratitude is never forgotten, especially by those who have the power to repay it in full." And below that, in handwritten ink, her full name, Elsie Jane Marlowe. It started with footsteps measured, deliberate, and impossible to ignore outside her flat at precisely 6 a.m. the next morning. And when Elsie rose, heart pounding and hands trembling slightly from the surreal events of the day before, she hesitated at the window and saw a woman in a navy blue pantsuit standing beneath the lamppost, holding a clipboard and an envelope and looking entirely out of place on her crumbling city street. But what froze her wasn't the woman's appearance. It was the identical hood symbol embroidered discreetly on her lapel, the same one from the card, the same as the paper left at the train station wall. And before fear or logic could settle, the woman looked directly up at her window, nodded once, and gestured for Elsie to come down. Instinct screamed for caution, but something deeper, a strange flicker of recognition or fate, told her this was inevitable, so she dressed quickly, walked downstairs barefoot in her haste, and opened the door to find the woman offering her the envelope without a word, inside of which was a formal document, a deed, and one cold line typed in black ink that read, "The Marlowe Estate, Greystone Hill, now belongs to you," with a notarized seal and a signature too precise to read. "There must be a mistake," Elsie stammered, her voice cracked and dry. But the woman simply stepped aside and pointed to a car she hadn't noticed, a long black sedan, waiting with its engine already running, and said, "You gave him bread. He gave you bricks, shall we?" And with that impossible line hanging in the air, Elsie found herself ushered into the back seat and taken away from everything she knew. Greystone Hill was 2 hours out of the city, a secluded forested ridge with sprawling private land and the kind of view that made your breath catch. And as they turned through a wrought iron gate adorned with the same hooded symbol etched in its arch, Elsie caught her first glimpse of the mansion, 3 stories of stone and stained glass, ivy clinging to the sides like veins, and a front door carved with stories in wood, and all she could think was, "This isn't real, this isn't mine, this can't be happening." Inside, the place was fully furnished, warm, and somehow familiar despite its size, and as the woman walked her through the halls, listing features like a silent realtor, Elsie noticed every detail had been tailored books she once owned lined the shelves, a piano she'd abandoned as a child sat in the sitting room, and in the kitchen, her favorite chipped mug was waiting beside a brand new espresso machine. How is this possible? She asked again, and the woman finally replied. He watched. Not in a cruel way, in a precise one. He saw what you sacrificed and recreated what you lost, which should have been comforting, but instead sent a chill down her spine, because someone had gone through her life in incredible detail, not just recent history, but childhood, family, even dreams she hadn't spoken aloud, and the eerie intimacy of it made her hands go cold. She stayed the night, unsure what else to do, and woke the next morning to find her old life erased. Her phone had no messages. Her job was apparently terminated with gratitude, and her bank account showed a deposit under the name Baker's Debt Fulfilled, enough money to live off for a year. The woman in the navy suit had vanished without a trace, and so had the car, and though every rational voice in her head begged her to leave, to call the police, to do something, the weight of peace inside the mansion kept her rooted, until, on the 4th night, she was woken by a sound she couldn't ignore, soft piano notes echoing from downstairs in the dead of night, playing a tune no one should know but her, a melody she wrote as a teenager and never shared. Trembling, she followed the sound into the music room and found no one there, only the piano still vibrating gently, the keys slowing to silence, and a note resting on the bench that simply said, "You see now, don't you?" And on the back of that paper, in tiny handwriting, "He's been waiting for you to remember what you gave him, not just bread but mercy, when no one else did." And that was the moment Elsie realized that this wasn't just repayment, it was a message, an invitation, and maybe even a warning from someone who wasn't just rich or powerful, but someone who knew what it meant to disappear and rebuild, and had done both. The first thing Elsie noticed when she woke on the 7th morning in the mansion wasn't the sunshine streaming through the stained glass windows, or the humming espresso machine in the kitchen. It was the absence of sound where there should have been peace, the kind of silence that was too aware of itself, like the house was holding its breath. And it was in that silence that she heard a faint scraping, like fingernails or footsteps, coming from somewhere behind the east wing wall. Behind a door she hadn't opened yet, a door that wasn't on any of the maps of the house she'd studied in awe just days before. Something about it was off, not locked, but resisting her touch, as though the wood itself was alive and reluctant. And when she finally twisted the knob and stepped inside, she found not a room but a hallway that curved like a spiral into the earth, lit by low yellow bulbs and covered in photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands framed and mounted along the walls, and each one was of her. Not posed, not planned, but real moments, feeding pigeons on her lunch break, staring at raindrops from her old flat, crying silently in the corner of a bus station when she thought no one was watching, and her breath caught as she ran her fingers along one frame after another, realizing these weren't pulled from social media or public records. No, these were too private, too raw. Someone had been watching her for years, and they had documented not just her life, but her loneliness. Near the bottom of the stairwell, she found a locked room with only one thing carved into the door, the same hood symbol, now blackened and cracked, as though burned into the wood. Behind it came the sound again, that soft scraping and something about it terrified her in a way the photographs hadn't, because it didn't sound mechanical, it sounded human. She backed away, heart thudding, and nearly screamed when the voice came deep, measured, and unmistakably the man from the train station. "You were kind when you had nothing. I only wanted to give you something to lose." And though the words were spoken calmly, there was a weight to them that made her dizzy, like they held a different meaning beneath their surface, a trapdoor under the compliment. She ran up the spiral and slammed the hallway door shut behind her, breathing hard. And for the first time in days, she truly considered leaving. But when she returned to her bedroom, she found her suitcase missing, the windows locked from the outside, and a single line scrawled across her bathroom mirror in black ink. "You can't leave until you understand what you freed." That night, the piano didn't play, the fridge wouldn't open, and all the lights flickered at once at exactly 3:03 a.m., a moment that struck her heart like a match, and in the darkness, she whispered aloud to the silence, "Who are you?" And the reply came instantly, from nowhere and everywhere at once. "I'm the man no one saw, who remembers everything they forgot, including you." And in that chilling moment, Elsie remembered something too, something she hadn't allowed herself to revisit since she was 14, and hiding behind a bakery shelf while her mother screamed at a man in rags who had broken in asking for bread, and how she had snuck the loaf to him when no one was looking, and how he had whispered, "One day, I'll return this favor with interest," and disappeared, and now, with her knees trembling and her breath fogging the cold air in the room, Elsie realized the man beneath the hood hadn't just been poor or hungry. He had been waiting, and this entire mansion might not be a gift after all, but a game, or a cage, or worse, a payment plan she hadn't known she signed. By the 8th day, reality itself felt distorted inside the mansion. Time seemed to hiccup. Spaces subtly shifted, and Elsie found herself waking up in rooms she hadn't fallen asleep in. But it was the library that finally broke her resolve. For when she stepped in just after sunset, every book on every shelf had been replaced with volumes titled only her name, Elsie Jane Marlowe, and when she pulled one down, hands trembling and heart pounding, she found that each page contained detailed transcripts of her life in first-person narration, as though someone or something had been not only watching but writing her thoughts in real time, decades of it journaled in ink that was warm to the touch, and she dropped the book with a choked sound, unable to breathe as realization dawned. This wasn't just observation. It was ownership. Someone had taken her life and turned it into a manuscript, and when she ran her hand across the spines of the hundreds of books lining the shelf, she found that each one was dated, with future volumes waiting blank but titled as if her story was still being written by an author with far too much control. It was then that the door opened without a sound, and a familiar figure stepped in, hooded, face still obscured, but taller now, straighter, his presence commanding the air like a symphony. And without waiting for permission, he crossed the room and placed a black leather book in her hands, thicker than the others, unlabeled, sealed with a red ribbon and wax symbol. "Your kindness made you visible," he said, his voice both comfort and curse, "so I made you permanent." Her voice cracked as she asked, "What do you want from me?" But he shook his head, as if she still didn't understand the shape of her own fate, and answered with a calmness that chilled her spine, "I was nothing until someone noticed me. You gave me bread, warmth, a name, and names are power." The wax seal broke in her hands with no effort, and the book fell open to a section titled The Ledger, where dozens, no, hundreds of names were written in looping, old-fashioned script, each paired with an entry beneath: a kindness received, a debt repaid, and often a consequence. And then she saw her name, her kindness, one loaf of sourdough still warm, and her debt to be paid in full through witness, shelter, memory, and suddenly it clicked. Why the woes full of echoes of her past, why it was so eerily tailored, and why escape seemed impossible. She wasn't being rewarded. She was being kept, archived, immortalized through observation, and as she dropped the book and staggered back, the hooded man pulled down his cowl slowly to reveal a face she hadn't seen in over a decade, aged but unmistakable. The very man from the bakery storeroom, the ghost from her memory, the one her mother screamed at. But she fed anyway, and he whispered, "You made me real, and now I make you eternal," before turning and vanishing down a corridor that hadn't been there before. She chased him, calling out, her voice ragged, but he was gone, and all that remained was a mirror hanging where the door had been, with a single phrase etched into its surface: "She who writes kindness into the world must accept what is written in return." And in the reflection behind her stood rows of blank books slowly filling themselves with new ink, each word forming in her own handwriting. It had been 13 days since Elsie entered the mansion, but when she checked the calendar in the hall, a calendar that was nailed to the wall and bore no digital counterpart, the date hadn't changed once, frozen in a silent scream of stillness. And that was when she truly understood that time did not pass here the way it did outside, because this place was not bound by clocks, but by stories, and hers was still being written, shaped by every step, every thought, every breath. And it had taken her all these days to understand the house wasn't just a gift or a curse. It was a memory palace, his memory palace, built from scraps of a life no one remembered but her. On the 14th morning, the front door creaked open for the first time since her arrival, not because it was unlocked, but because the mansion itself had finally decided she was ready. And on the porch stood a girl no older than 10, soaked in rain, barefoot and shivering, holding a torn paper bag with 2 crushed croissants inside. And without thinking, Elsie pulled her in, wrapped her in a blanket, and made her real tea. From the still-stocked kitchen that only obeyed her now, and when she asked the girl where she came from, the child looked up with wide, calm eyes and said, "I gave him food when I had none. He sent me here to be remembered," and the realization that the house had opened not as an escape hatch but as a new door in a cycle hit her like thunder. She watched the girl sleep in one of the upstairs rooms. Tucked into blankets the mansion had folded on its own, and then she returned to the spiral stairwell in the east wing, where the photos of her life were now joined by the girl's grainy, quiet moments from cities Elsie had never seen, and at the very bottom, the once locked door was open, inviting her into a new chamber that hadn't existed until now. A gallery with portraits in oil and charcoal, dozens of them, all of strangers she didn't know, but every face carried an echo of kindness. Some long-forgotten act of compassion, frozen, eternal gratitude. In the center of the room was a desk with a blank journal and a pen that refilled itself, and a note that read, "You are now the one who watches, the one who repays." She stood for hours, perhaps days, it was hard to know anymore, writing entries about people she had never met, but somehow knew everything about, and for each page she filled, a new room opened somewhere in the house, as if her words summoned them, created them, gave shelter to the echoes of mercy scattered across the world. It was only later, when she walked past a mirror in the west corridor and caught her reflection, that she noticed something else. The hood was now hers, draped over her shoulders like a cloak, not of fabric but of meaning, and the symbol that once belonged to the man now glowed faintly at her collarbone, not etched or stitched, but part of her skin. And though a part of her wept for the life she had lost, the ordinary, struggling, beautiful life of loneliness and humanity, another part, deeper and older and more eternal, understood. She had become something more, the living ledger, the archivist of kindness, the final chapter in a stranger's journey, and the first page in the stories of others. And so she sat at the desk as the seasons outside stayed still, as people knocked at the door without ever seeing her face. And she wrote, and she welcomed, and she remembered, because the man beneath the hood had never wanted power or worship, he had wanted to be seen. And when she gave him that, he had built a home not for himself, but for others like him, for those who gave without asking, for those forgotten by the world, but never forgotten by the house that remembers.